Now, in studying these spontaneous remissions with people that healed themselves of various conditions, it was interesting to note that independent of their culture, or independent of their creed, or independent of their educational status, or their religion, independent of their gender, they basically said, I'm going to observe a different outcome. And I'm going to hold on to this observation, independent of the feedback from my body, independent of the feedback from my environment, and independent of time. Now the frontal lobe, the crowning achievement of the human being, allows us to do that. You see, the frontal lobe gives us permission to make thought more real than anything else. The frontal lobe gives us permission to hold on to a concept, to hold on to an idea, to hold on to a vision or a dream, independent of the circumstances that exist in our world, independent of the circumstances that exist in our body, independent of the circumstances that exist in reference to time. And those are the things and the traits that we secretly admire in all great people in antiquity, whether it was Martin Luther King or William Wallace, someone who had a vision, someone who had an idea. A hero said, I believe in these morals and I believe in these ethics. And even though my environment isn't aligned with my thinking is more important than my environment. And the frontal lobe in the human being allows us the privilege, it gives us the privilege to make thought more real than anything. Now, most species in nature, the way in which they change is that they're subjected to some harsh environmental stimuli. They're subjected to something in the environment. And then they have to adapt, or they have to accommodate, or if they have to acclimate to some type of environmental stimulus, whether it's cold, or whether it's heat, or whether it's any particular thing. And what happens is that the species is introduced into this particular environment, and then over a series of generations, as the same species is introduced to the same harsh environment, over a period of time, over several generations, that species will modify its behavior and change its genetics. That's called evolution. But human beings don't have to do that. Because of the size of the frontal lobe and because of our ability to speculate possibilities and ask about potentials and think about the what-ifs, we can invent new ideas and new ways of being. And it gives us the privilege then to modify our behavior in the same lifetime. It gives us the privilege to modify our actions in a week. We can modify how we behave in a day, and we can change in a moment. The only object that we need to master is this skill called observation. When we begin to use the brain properly, when we begin to pay attention to a concept or to an idea, this amazing thing happens in the brain. The frontal lobe lowers the volume to the external stimuli. It lowers the volume to the body and the feedback loop from the body to the brain. It lowers the volume to the feedback from the environment. You don't know if it's cold or warm. You don't know if it's dark or light. Your brain becomes the magnifier of thought. And it lowers the volume to time. In other words, as we hold a concept in the frontal lobe, we will lose track of time and space. Now, science is beginning to understand that the way in which we make circuits in the brain, the way in which we begin to make connections in the brain, aside from allowing the environment to mold and shape our brain, that we can begin and mold and shape our brain by paying attention. And if we can hold on to an idea, we begin to wire those connections in our brain. By wiring those connections in our brain, we begin to leave footprints of those concepts neurologically in the tissues. And those footprints then can act as the foundation in the way in which we can act and behave. So, the frontal lobe then, the crowning achievement of the human being, allows thought to be more real than anything else. And when we begin to assemble ideas, and we begin to assemble concepts, and we put all of our attention on that concept, the frontal lobe will lower the volume to all the extraneous stimuli, and the only thing that will become real is thought itself. When that happens, there's a physical change in the brain. The brain then takes that holographic image that we're holding in the frontal lobe, and creates a pattern of connections that associate with that concept or that idea. So when we learn new things, when we're learning new things, we make connections in our brain. We make new connections in our brain. When we memorize those things, or when we remember those things, we sustain those connections, or we maintain those connections. Memory is maintaining those connections. Learning is forming those connections. So we can learn from the environment. We can learn from our sensual experiences. But then we can only be as great as how our environment is dictating our experience. But if we learn knowledge and we learn information that's unconventional, quantum physics, that the observer participates in the nature of reality and that our thoughts actually matter, from the subatomic particles all the way to the very large, and that maybe our observation, our ability to pay attention, will begin to format new connections in our brain that will allow us to perceive things exactly the way they are. And that may be because our brain processes billions of bits of information every second. But we're only aware of those bits of information that have to do with the body, the environment, and time. That we can begin to make new connections and learn new knowledge. We'll begin to see what has always existed, but we've filtered out of the equation, just like those people that did the experiment with the lenses. Now I want to talk about how the brain learns and how those connections are formulated. We know from a scientific standpoint that neurons, nerve cells that exist in the brain, when they connect, they exchange information. And as they connect and they exchange information, that connecting point is a learned understanding related to a concept. As I said, when we remember something, we activate those connections again and bring them to life. Now, we have enormous amounts of connections in our brain. Infinite connections, just about trillions and trillions of connections. And every place where those neurons connect and exchange information, it's mapped as a pattern or a sequence that reflects some idea, something that we've learned, a trait, a behavior, a skill, a tendency, a feeling even. And all these connections are the sum total of who we are as an individual. So everybody's different because they have had different experiences in their life, they've learned different knowledge, and they have a certain amount of genetic connections that they're given. And that's basically the foundation of where we start from as individuals. Now, most people at a certain point in their life rely on those developed circuits and never learn anything new. They allow feeling to become the means of thinking. They stop learning and they start feeling. And when we get to the point where learning is stopped and feeling is initiated, that's when we're living out our genetic propensities. That's when we're living out the predetermined genetic future that exists for us as individuals. When we learn new knowledge, the brain begins to reformat itself. It begins to fire in new sequences and new patterns and in new connections. And if we can maintain those connections for an extended period of time, we can modify and change our behavior. And those people who had spontaneous remissions, what they did was they gained knowledge and they began to apply that knowledge by asking what ifs. And they understood if they could connect with that intelligence that was keeping their heart beating and digesting their food, if they could whisper in the ear of the giant that was running their physical body, that knew how to make cells, that knew how to organize DNA, if they could have their will match its will, if they could have their mind match its mind, if they could have their love of life match its love of life, because it was what was continuously giving them life, if they reasoned that by changing their thoughts, would it send a new signal to their cells? And by patterning new connections in their brain, would it ultimately produce a new physiological effect in their body? So the reinvention process meant to reorganize those circuits to a greater ideal of themselves.